Hi guys, today we're going to read 2 more chapters of The Mouse and the Motorcycle by Beverly Cleary. When we left off, it was on the end of chapter 10, and I'm going to start on chapter 11 with the search. I have to go out into the hotel, Ralph informed his relatives. I have to help the boy. Oh, this was because the boy was very sick and he needed they needed aspirin to help get his fever down. Oh no, not out into the hotel, cried Ralph's mother. Not while the housekeeper is looking for mice. If you're seen, we'll all be in danger. I'll be back before dawn, said Ralph staunchly. I must go. Don't try to stop me. See here, my boy, aren't you being a little bit dramatic? Asked Uncle Lester. Whatever do you have to go out into the hotel for? To pilfer a pill, said Ralph. An aspirin tablet. His answer was dramatic enough even for Uncle Lester. His entire family stared at him in disbelief. Not an aspirin. Not after his own father had been poisoned by one of the dreaded tablets. An aspirin? Ralph's mother gasped. No, Ralph, not that. Anything but that. It's the only way. Ralph stood tall and brave. The boy has a fever and he needs an aspirin, and I'm going to find him one. Oh, Ralph! His mother hid her face in her paws, but Ralph quavered, Aunt Sissy. Remember your father? You can't carry an aspirin in your cheek pouches. It would poison you. How could you get it here? I'll find a way. Ralph was outwardly steadfast in his determination, but inside he wondered how he would manage to get an aspirin into room 215 if he did find one. Roll it, perhaps. Ralph, stay here, pleaded his mother. You're too young. You let your Uncle Lester go. Well, now let's talk this over, said Uncle Lester. I'm not too young, and I haven't a moment to lose. Ralph, who was really frightened by what he was about to do, was also enjoyed the drama of the moment. Goodbye, I shall return before dawn. Ralph, promise me you'll be careful, pleaded his mother. Promise me you won't climb into suitcases like your Aunt Adrian. Ralph's Aunt Adrian, who liked nice things, had climbed into a suitcase to examine a nylon stocking. Someone had closed the suitcase, and Aunt Adrian had never been seen again. It was hoped that she had been carried away to a life of luxury. Promise me, Ralph, cried his mother, but her son was already on his way out of the knothole. Ralph scurried across the carpet of room 215, flattened himself, and squeezed under the door. Once out in the hall, his courage ebbed. The aspirin tablet seemed a very small thing to find in such a vast place. It would be much easier to find the motorcycle. No, thought Ralph, I must not think about that motorcycle. Ralph began to feel pretty small himself, much smaller than he had felt during his show of bravery back in the mouse nest. Down in the lobby, a clock struck 1. There was not a moment to lose. He ran to the next room, squeezed under the door, and reached under the beds and the dressers while the 2 guests slept soundly. All he found was a bobby pin. He skipped room 211 because his enemy, that little terrier, was still there, and he ran to room 209. A hurried search, frightened because of the loud and uneven snores that came from one of the beds, revealed nothing but a few puzzle crumbs, which Ralph did not have time to eat. On and on Ralph went down the hall. Under doors, around beds and dressers, there was not a single aspirin tablet to be found. In one of the rooms, he did not see a penny that had rolled under a luggage rack, and remembered his mother's wish to leave a tip for room service. But tonight he had no time for pennies. He must press on and find an aspirin. A small doubt began to creep into Ralph's thoughts. As he ran down the hall, the last room of the 2nd floor, maybe there was no aspirin. Maybe he was risking his life and the lives of his family for nothing. But Ralph pushed that thought aside. He would not let himself be discouraged. If there was no aspirin on the 2nd floor, there had to be someplace on the ground. There had to be one someplace on the ground floor. Tonight he was willing to brave the stairs to find it. He flattened himself and squeezed under the last door of the 2nd floor. There was nothing under either of the beds but the things Keith called dust mice. There was no sound but the rattle of the windows and the wind. Ralph started across the carpet toward the dresser. Then suddenly a light from the bedside table blinded him. He stopped, rooted to the carpet by fear, even though it was not likely that anyone was going to cut off his tail with a carving knife. He heard someone slip out of bed, utter a sound halfway between a squeal and a scream, and before Ralph knew what happened, what was happening, an ordinary drinking glass had been clapped down over him, and there he stood in a glass trap. By then his eyes were adjusted to the light, and looking, he found himself facing a pair of feet. Looking up, he saw the feet belonged to a young woman in a pink nightgown. Mary Lou, wake up, she whispered to the young woman on the other bed. Look what I've caught. Huh? Said Mary Lou, blinking and raising up on one elbow. Her hair was done up in pink rollers. Betty, are you out of your mind? It must be past 1 o'clock. The night was slipping by much too quickly for the trapped mouse. He was terrified, and he was desperate. No one in his family had ever been trapped under a drinking glass before. Worst of all, he was failing Keith and endangering his family. "Wake up, Mary Lou, and look," insisted Betty. "I was getting up to stop the rattle of the window, and I caught a mouse." This news roused Mary Lou from the bed, and the two young women knelt on the carpet and looked at Ralph, who promptly turned his back. He did not care to be stared at in his misery, but it was no use. The women moved around to the other side of the glass. "Isn't he darling?" said Betty. "Just look at his cunning little paws." Mary Lou leaned closer for a better look. "And his little ears. Aren't they sweet?" Betty was delighted. It was disgusting. It was bad enough to be trapped and stared at, but to have this pair carry on in such a gushy fashion was almost more than Ralph could stomach. Cunning little paws, indeed. They were strong paws. Paws for grasping the hand grips of a motorcycle. "Oh, Betty, do you suppose we could take him back to Wichita with us?" asked Mary Lou. "My third graders would love him." "So would my kindergarten," agreed Betty. "We could keep him in a cage at the ledge, and the children could bring him food from home. It would be such a good experience for them to have a pet in the classroom." "Well," thought Ralph grimly, "I always wanted to travel." A cage in a kindergarten in Wichita, however, was not exactly the destination he had in mind. The minutes were slipping by dangerously fast. He had to do something. "Look," he shouted through the glass in desperation. "Let me go. Please let me go. There's something terribly important I've got to do." "He squeaked," marveled Betty. "He's adorable," squealed Mary Lou. It was no use. The young women could not speak his language. Ralph was in despair. He thought of Keith tossing feverishly in his bed, and of his family huddled in the mouse nest waiting for his safe return. "But I don't see how we could take him back to Wichita," Betty said sensibly. "We're driving to San Francisco and then to Disneyland before we start back. How could we carry him thousands of miles?" The two teachers looked thoughtfully at Ralph, who knew his fate depended upon their decision. Was he to be carried to Disneyland and eventually to a ledge in a kindergarten room in Wichita? Or would they let him go? A third possibility crossed Ralph's mind. Perhaps they would leave him under the glass for the housekeeper to see. He hoped not. He did not think he could last that long. Already the insides of the glass were beginning to feel warm and airless. "I suppose we really shouldn't turn him loose in the hotel," said Mary Lou. "Mice are pests, even if they're cute." The teacher not only destroyed Ralph's hopes, she hurt his feelings as well, calling him a pest when he was on an errand of mercy. From the mouse's point of view, the teachers were the pests. "I know," exclaimed Betty, suddenly causing Ralph to look over his shoulder for a clue of what she knew. "I know how we could get rid of him without hurting him." The young teacher reached over to the bedside table where she picked up a picture postcard. She slid it carefully under the glass and under Ralph's feet, so that now he was standing on a postcard. He noticed the picture was of a giant redwood tree, from the same postcard all travelers bought when they came to California. "Now what are we going to do?" asked Mary Lou. "Watch." Betty carefully lifted the postcard, Ralph in the glass, and walked across the room. Even though he knew it was useless, Ralph scrabbled around in his tiny prison. He was afraid she was taking him toward the wash basin. He had heard of mice being drowned by people who did not like traps. The teacher walked not to the wash basin, but to the open window. She held Ralph across the sill, removing the postcard from the glass, and gave it a little jerk that shook Ralph off into the vines that grew into the side of the building. "There," she said, and closed the window, leaving Ralph clinging to a vine high above the ground. Chapter 12. An Errand of Mercy. Owls, thought Ralph as he clung to the Virginia creeper that filled his lungs with the cool night air. It was such a relief after the stuffy drinking glass. "I've always wanted to climb down this vine and explore the ground floor," he reminded himself grimly, "and now I have to." Ralph had never before been outdoors beneath the moon and the stars. He felt small and frightened and alone. Slowly, paw after paw, he worked his way along the shoots and tendrils. An owl uncomfortably close in a pine tree hooted, and Ralph huddled shivering in the shadow of a leaf, aware that he was losing his precious seconds. A night wind rattled the windows, and the owl glided off across the parking lot. Ralph inched his way down the vine. It was a long, winding route full of detours in the ground floor window, which, to Ralph's relief, was open. Upon reaching the sill, Ralph leaped to the floor of the room. And there were 3 young men of college age were sleeping in 2 beds and one asleep on a sleeping bag on the floor. An aspirin. I must find an aspirin, thought Ralph, darting around the bed. He bumped into the dust mouse, which startled him, but he did not find an aspirin. He was in such a hurry he ran right over the man who was in the sleeping bag instead of taking time to go around. There, under the dresser, gleaming in the shaft of moonlight, he saw a round white pill. He went closer. Yes, it really was an aspirin tablet. At last, Ralph was positive it was an aspirin and not some other pill because it had letters stamped on it. Ralph could not read the letters, but he knew they stood for aspirin. He had been warned about them often enough. Now all Ralph had to do was figure out how to get that pill upstairs to room 215. Telling himself that in spite of all that had happened that night, it could not be much past 1 o'clock in the morning, Ralph half pushed, half rolled that aspirin tablet around in the main sleeping bag around the man in the sleeping bag on the floor. He shoved it under the door with great difficulty, squeezed under himself. The first floor carpet was thicker and of better quality than the second floor. Ralph worked his way with the aspirin down the hall to the lobby where the night clerk was asleep on the couch. The glassy eyes of the deer heads mounted on the knotty pine walls seemed to stare at Ralph. So did the giant eye of the television set. Slowly he moved his precious load across the lobby to the stairs, and there he stopped. How could he manage to get that aspirin up the stairs? If he picked it up and tried lifting it, even though he knew he could not reach the first step with it. The night clerk tossed on the couch and made a gobbling, snorting noise. Ralph dropped the aspirin in panic and looked wildly about for a hiding place. With one terrific leap, he dived under the grandfather clock between the elevator and the stairs. It was immediately plain from the dust that no one ever cleaned under the clock. Aha! Aha! Ralph struggled to control a sneeze. Above him, the works of the clock began to make grinding noises. Achoo! The sneeze could not be held back. Bong! The clock struck 1:30, forcing Ralph to clap his hands over his ears. How his famous ancestor, the one that ran up the clock, hickory-dickory-dock, stood that racket, he did not know. Peeking out, Ralph discovered the night clerk had slept soundly through the din, and so he ventured out from under the clock to continue his struggle with the aspirin tablet. Since carrying the pill up the stairs was impossible, Ralph had to find another way. The elevator. Ridiculous. A mouse could not run an elevator. Then quite unexpectedly, a whole plan of action popped into his mind. Ralph had a genuine inspiration. First, he rolled the aspirin to a safe place behind the ashtray stand beside the elevator. Then, empty-pawed, he climbed to the stairs to the second floor and ran down the hall to room 215 where he squeezed under the door. Keith was still half awake, his eyes glinting with fever under the heavy lids. Psst, said Ralph. I found an aspirin for you. Murmured Keith. An aspirin tablet. I found an aspirin. Where is it? Keith was more awake now. But it's down on the first floor. Oh, Keith was obviously disappointed. Now wait, said Ralph. I can get you up there. I can get it up here, but I've got to have some help. You'll have to let me take your sports car. You're too young, mumbled Keith. I am not. And it was true that Ralph felt very much older than he had when he lost the motorcycle. Come on, you need that aspirin, don't you? You already lost my motorcycle. Oh, come on. Ralph was growing more impatient as he felt the night slipping by. If you won't let me take your sports car, will you let me take the ambulance? Well, I guess so. Keith did not feel equal to arguing with a determined mouse. He picked up his ambulance from the bedside table and set it on the floor. Here. One more thing, said Ralph anxiously. Do you think you can manage to open the door for me? I know you feel terrible, but it's the last thing I'll ask, honest. And I promise I'll have an aspirin up here in no time. Keith sighed, but he slid his feet from under the sheet, hanging onto the bedside table, reached over and opened the door. Ralph was already seated in the white ambulance with the red cross painted on the side. Wee, wee, wee! He took the corner into the hall and 2 wheels, and he sped down the floor to between the wall and the carpet until he came to room 211. Here he slowed down and then went, wee, 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 good and loud. This carried him, as he had planned, to the elevator. It was a critical moment. Now he would find out if his plan was going to work. The little dog in room 211 began to whimper and then bark, just as Ralph had planned. In a moment, the door opened and the man stumbled out with the little terrier in his arms. Oh, all right, he grumbled. I'll walk you. Shut up, will ya? Ralph waited, his paws tense on the steering wheel. The man walked groggily to the closed elevator door, where he managed, in spite of the wiggling dog in his arms, to push the button. Soon the elevator door slid open. Ralph knew that timing was important. The man entered the elevator. The dog barked. Wee, wee, said Ralph, and hard enough and fast enough to shoot the ambulance at a great speed across the yawning crack between the floor of the hall and the floor of the elevator before the man turned around. As the dog's owner turned, Ralph steered skillfully around his feet and parked the ambulance behind him. The man pressed the button, the doors closed, and the elevator actually began to go down. Do you know what you are? The man said sleepily to the dog. You are a nuisance. That's what you are, a four-footed, hair-covered nuisance. The dog ignored his master. I know you're down there, he yapped to Ralph. If I could just get down, I'd get you. Ralph did not answer. He was taking no chances. He waited quietly inside of his ambulance until the man had carried the dog out before he drove out of the elevator. He jumped out of the ambulance, opened the rear doors, seized the precious aspirin, and boosted it inside. Slamming the doors, he ran around and jumped into the driver's seat. There was not an instant to lose. Wee, wee! The ambulance moved toward the elevator, but unfortunately by this time Ralph was slightly out of breath. The front wheels of the ambulance caught in the crack between the floor of the lobby and the floor of the elevator. The ambulance was stuck. Oh no, thought Ralph, not now. I can't fail now. Wee, wee! He managed to gasp when the wheels spun, but the ambulance did not move. Ralph jumped out, put his shoulder to the rear of the vehicle, and pushed it with all of his strength. Nothing happened. In a moment the man would be returning with his dog. Desperate, Ralph climbed back into the ambulance. He took a breath so deep he thought his lungs would surely burst. Wee, wee, wee! He made the sound hard and fast and high-pitched, and the wheels spun. The ambulance moved slowly at first, and then as the tires got a grip on the floor of the elevator, it shot out of the crack, across the elevator, hit the rear wall with a bump. Ralph collapsed over the steering wheel, limp with relief, just as the man came back through the lobby with his dog. I guess some boy lost his toy ambulance, muttered the man, more awake now as he stepped and pressed the button. Toy, thought Ralph indignantly. This ambulance is carrying medical supplies for the sick. Boy, my foot, yapped the terrier. It's that dastardly mouse. Let me down and I'll get him. Ralph did not answer. He was saving all of his breath now to get the ambulance across that crack once more. The man slapped the dog lightly on the nose and said, Be quiet. I took you outside, didn't I? Fortunately, the elevator door stayed open behind the man as he walked out, so Ralph had no trouble driving the ambulance out and down the hall to room 215. The door had blown shut, but he did not care. He jumped out of the ambulance and ran around the back where he unloaded the aspirin, shoved it under the bedroom door, and squeezed in after it. Keith, I've got it! Ralph was filled with triumph. I brought you an aspirin! And that's where we will stop today and start up tomorrow with chapters 13, and that might be it. 13 is the last chapter. So tomorrow we'll read the last chapter of The Mouse and the Motorcycle by Beverly Cleary for Stark County Elementary School.